welcome to AI Fund's Launcher Series. I'm Kimberly Rose, the VP of Marketing for the Venture Studio. Every episode, I will be talking with an industry influencer who will be giving advice on building companies and lessons learned for the founder community. Today, Susan Thomas, the founder and CEO of Tenfold, and I will address the fundamental marketing questions every founder should know to establish themselves in their market. Tenfold is a full-service marketing agency and is ranked as the top 8% of all PR agencies in the U.S. Susan's team has helped many of their clients have successful exits, and they have won more than 60 national awards for best marketing campaigns. Welcome, Susan.
Hi, Kim. Thanks for having me.
Well, you have a lot of experience in working with all different phases of companies, including startups. So I'm really excited to hear some of your feedback.
Well, thank you. Startups are my favorite.
So tell me why.
I feel like as a startup, you have so many opportunities to set the market, to say new things. You don't have to worry about the skeletons in the closet or what's gone before. It's a green field of opportunity. And I feel like a lot of the startups are really the ones that are changing the world. A lot of larger companies are buying startups to create innovation. And if not for the startups, we might not have that innovation in the industry to the degree we do today.
And we sure have a lot of them.
We do.
Many different types of technologies.
For sure. Hard to keep up sometimes.
So I have a list of questions here, but feel free to, if I'm not asking questions you want to address, because I know there's a lot to cover when it comes to talking about marketing for startups.
Great.
What do you think are the biggest hurdles that early stage founders encounter when they're actually starting their marketing initiatives?
Gosh, the biggest, I think we could be here all night if we really wanted to talk about all of them. Oftentimes when early stage founders are getting going, they're thinking of what's going on for their company and their customers. And what I often find that they do too little of is looking around at the market and understanding what else is out there in the market. They often are sort of weak at explaining how they compete with other solutions out there or what customers might do differently with their solution than they're already doing. Too often I hear founders say that there is no competition or it's a do-it-yourself competition. And that, to most learned people in the market, spells trouble, because if there's no market, then there's also no budget set aside for that solution. And so they're going to have trouble getting market traction. When you don't have competitors and you're not willing to create that narrative for others, they're going to create it for you. So the worst thing in the world is you think you're actually going to be in the DevOps lifecycle and somebody decides that you're actually a tool for DevOps or for developers, which is a completely different track. And you can get pigeonholed, you can get assigned the wrong narrative, people can decide your value isn't as good as it should be, whereas if you've done the work to understand the market in the first place, you might have a better opportunity to be positioned a bit better.
So how early should they start marketing?
Well, I think they should start talking about marketing as they're designing their product. I think you need to start with the end in mind. So really the product design, and I know product design often in early days is influenced by those first customers, and that can be a bit problematic as well, because if you're not thinking about the market as you're designing it, you may not fit in very well or may not compete very well.
Can you give me some examples of where you've started early? So you have an early stage company that's come talk to you. What's the steps that you start with the early stage founder?
The first thing is I want to understand what their end goal is, what they're trying to accomplish, what kind of reputation they want to have in the market. Maybe not who their competitors are, but who they'd like to be considered alongside, what conversations they want to join and why they think they're going to be joining those conversations, what their idea is for the ideal customer and the use case for their solution, how they came up with the idea and where they see it headed, what down the road they're likely to incorporate, and who right now might be a partner that could end up being a competitor. All of those questions are really, really important as you start to think about the positioning for a company. And they might not have all those answers, but getting them thinking along those lines is usually very instructional for them. And even in the way they design those first iterations of their website so that they know who to attract. You see, the funny thing about it is oftentimes there's never a founder that I have met that didn't want to be in the Wall Street Journal, as an example. When we talk about that and I get to know a little bit more about who they're trying to sell to, if I find out their buyer is actually a technical buyer, we can often make coverage goals and a lot of their visibility goals much easier for them. There's a lower bar to get in an eWeek or, a developer publication than there is, for example, to get in the Wall Street Journal.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I have another question, and this is experience that I've run into as well in the past, is what role does the founder play in their marketing initiatives? Because a lot of times what I've seen is they hire a marketing agency, and therefore the marketing agency should just go off and do their thing and create awareness, lead gen, etc. So what is your view on what the early stage founder's role is?
Well, I think too often, like you mentioned, like the founder wants to hire the agency and consider that task complete and mark it off their list. The problem is that they are the vision for the company and they are the sole source of truth. So us as an agency can create all kinds of positioning ideas and even campaign ideas, but unless those fit into the overall vision that the founder has for the company, they won't work. Oftentimes we'll recommend that a founder, for example, help design some data that we might collect or we might talk about. Data is a very popular thing to report on because it's one of those things that media are regularly talking about, especially if it's influential in the way the market is going to trend or something that's happening with end users. And so that often is impossible to do as an outside agency without understanding the intricacies of the product and the data that they're able to collect. So a founder has to be available. They have to be in there brainstorming. They have to be offering ideas. Without that, most marketing is going to be pretty flat.
Excellent. Agree with you 100%. Just over the past, I would say probably 3 to 5 years, I've seen PR changing. What are your views and where it is now, where it's going?
Yeah, I can't believe how much PR has changed. The last time they did a census, they found that the number of reporters was down 50%, and that was 8 years ago.
Wow.
We're about ready to see the new census, and I'm quite confident that it'll be down at least another 50%. The first thing to know is that the separation of church and state, that is, what I mean by that is editors and advertising, is no longer there. I've actually overheard in our bullpen editors telling our PR people that unless they're giving them some sort of a fee, they're not interested in hearing their pitch. So there's a very major blur of the lines between editors and publishers. I also would say there's just very few reporters these days. Most reporters are contract reporters, and they're hired to either write a very specific story or they're hired when they bring a story that's of interest to the publishers. That's tough because stories become like fresh produce. After a while, they're not interesting anymore and the trend or the idea has passed. So contract reporters have to be really, really careful about the interviews that they take. And they have to make sure that they can sell these stories. They've also juggled quite a bit, the folks in the industry. How long was Don Clark the managing editor of the Wall Street Journal technology section? Now he's a contributing reporter for the New York Times. Very, very different. And when he left, so did the rules changed, as they are changing today. I think also just a fundamental difference in PR that we never saw before is how important keywords, hashtags, trending topics are to the journalists that we're briefing. Because unless those journalists are getting clicks on their stories, it's likely they won't have a job. So we have to be very aligned with what's working from a marketing perspective.
What do you recommend to your clients? They don't have that story to get into the Wall Street Journal. They don't have that nugget that a press is glomming onto, but they need to build awareness and create lead generation for their offerings. What's your recommendation?
Well, I think what's interesting is a lot of companies have become their own publishers, and they've been very creative about getting the word out. Sometimes your story isn't right for the vast number of reporters, but you still have an important story for your potential customers. And from that perspective, content is out there, and there are so many interesting ways to get your message heard and seen. We a lot of times help people create short form videos and longer form videos, case studies written and in video, blog formats, contributing blogs to their partners' blogs and having their partners contribute to them, publishing on Medium, finding other ways to publish and getting their story out there are all creative ways of adding to or augmenting what reporters might do for you.
Great. With PR, my view has always been it can't be, a siloed island. And with that, there's so much of the intersection with SEO, other marketing initiatives. It really goes hand in hand. Tell me a little bit about how you work with clients from that perspective. Obviously, getting articles or getting backlinks for SEO. It's not just about getting an article. What do you advise companies when they're looking, from a perspective of PR, it's not just PR, but really looking at the integrated campaigns, and what's your recommendations and what they should do?
Well, I think with these economic times, the one big trend that I think everyone has had to jump on is that we're all here to support sales right now. And I think, long gone are the days where PR is simply brand awareness. If you're simply brand awareness, you have a very tiny budget and nobody really cares. Or if you have a budget at all. A lot of people don't even have budgets right now for brand awareness. So I think the first thing that happened was there was a bit of a mandate that PR would begin playing nicely with the other groups in the organization, which included lead gen and also the web architects and the people that are in charge of the website, which also have lead gen quota kind of things. So the first thing to know is what keywords are they prioritizing? What things are they trying to own from an SEO perspective? What are their ad campaigns and how do we complement those? And those are all really important. In fact, the best thing that probably happened to the PR group was when PR sort of won the war on social media, or to some degree where that was going to go, largely came to the PR people. And so being able to use those social media analytics tools to understand the personas that are interacting with the brand and understand what those personas are doing, the hashtags they're reacting to, the watering holes they're going to for their information, and the posts they're creating about the topics have become very handy in the PR group being able to contribute to overall marketing's efficacy.
Can you go a little bit into depth about industry influencers and how that's a key part of comms?
Sure. I think that the idea of industry influencers is not a new concept. It started with the industry analysts way back when, and all the product marketing people were responsible for those influencers. And by and large, that was a good place to put that responsibility because those product marketing people had the technical depth to convince the industry analysts who were quite technical that their product deserved a certain look. What product marketing sometimes fell short in was learning to build campaigns for those industry influencers. They didn't always do that. And so there was this weird thing about who owned the analysts. Well, now the concept of industry influencers is more plainly and clearly owned by your communications agency, your PR group, or outbound communications, however you decide to talk about them, because they understand the idea of campaigns and progress and milestones and measuring influence and how that has supported the brand. And also understanding the conditions in which those influencers are working. A lot of influencers these days, not so different than industry analysts, want to be paid for their influence. And so there are prices for that. That may be a day rate, that may be a project rate. And some of them want to comment on things that they find are truly interested and are more paid by buyers and users. And so understanding the personalities of all those and how they make money and how they stay in business is really, really important. And making sure you stay on the right side of those guys and gals are really important as well.
Right. So with that, being on the right side, let's say you're working with a client and one of these industry analysts is a little bit biased on their competitor, then what?
Very, very tricky. And I guess the first thing I would ask is how influenced are they? These days, there's a lot of favors that we get because we used to have great arguments over who was more influential, Forrester or Gartner, and I think it depended on the technology and the analyst sometimes.
Right.
Although Gartner was certainly a larger institution. On influencers, the information and the data is a bit more clear. You can actually run a social influence score, and you can understand how big their influence audience is, what their audience is comprised, who their audience is comprised of, what kinds of buyers and decision makers are in their audience, what kind of engagement rates they get, and make some really interesting decisions based on data that we could never make before. And so if an influencer that is not as sort of medium influence, is really biased towards a competitor, I might recommend that that client move along to the next influencer and see what we could do with other folks. If it's going to be really interesting, I think we've got to do some sleuthing and figure out why they like the competitor so much.
Right.
Hopefully it's not their brother or cousin.
So another question that I see actually quite a bit, this day and age, anybody can be an industry influencer. They have a blog and away they go, they make a name for themselves.
Right.
I've seen it in the past where somebody has spent a lot of time really building their own brand, creating themselves as an influencer.
Right.
And then, for example, one of your clients might not respect who this person is, but they're out there and they are an influencer in that particular industry. What's your recommendation?
You know, that reminds me so much again of my client. You know, I've had clients say they don't think Gartner has any good advice for them, or Forrester. And my advice is always, yes, please sit there, nod, smile, and you know, contribute to the extent that you can, because picking a fight with them will do you absolutely no good. They don't necessarily make more money than you do, but they do influence more people than you do. So my advice is always the advice that my mother gave me when I was just a little girl: you catch more flies with sugar than you do with vinegar. And so I try to repeat that to my clients as often as possible. On the other hand, I think the advice goes back to, who are they influencing? I often see that influencers that maybe have just a small amount of technical capability or acumen, not great business acumen, can fool some of the marketing people initially because they might be saying the right buzzwords. But when it comes right down to it, their influence over end users and buyers is very small. And so that influence isn't often long-lived. They're found out eventually.
Absolutely. So people talk about PR being storytelling. How do you come up with that right story?
You know, I think that the story is often within my clients. It's just me giving them permission to say the whole thing. One of our arguably most successful accounts was the 3.5 years we spent with AppDynamics. And when I met Joe T, he was a former CA employee. He was sharing a cubicle with the guy that started New Relic, who was one of their hottest competitors, and they both worked for CA. And Joe T had a great story. He'd come over from India with $100 in his pocket. He had to work really hard. He saw the mistakes CA made, and he really believed in this industry and what it could do. And he wanted to take it further to measure the efficacy of the application itself and figure out where things were going wrong. And a lot of the values that he learned in that process of coming here, the work ethic, the way of looking at things, all the things that he did were really instrumental in shaping who the company became, and as it got bought by Cisco for $3.2 billion. And so that kind of outcome doesn't happen to everybody. He wasn't telling that story initially. He was telling the story that so often technical founders do, which is the technology story about how clever the technology is. And most of that story doesn't even register in the register of mere humans. So it's almost like we can't hear it, like sounds that dogs can hear that people can't hear. It's like that. So we actually were able to pull out more common things, and it was really great to see how receptive people were to that story.
Fantastic. Yes, it's the storytelling is definitely an art. And
yeah, and I think people really are craving that humanistic element to the story. You know, not everybody's a human after all, and people like reading those stories.
Right. Anything else you can tell our community, or recommendations, or anything that we haven't discussed that you really would like to communicate just in your past experiences and what's worked for your clients?
Yeah, I think that a lot of startup founders think about the process of, they get started with marketing after the product's done. They have a sequential kind of perspective on how they're going to do things. They're going to build it, they're going to market it, they're going to sell it. So I think that's sort of a misnomer. I think that as they start, they need to think about, as they're building it, how that's going to play in the market. What's happening with the competitors? What are the competitors saying? You know, I love thinking about that in the range of like identity management. people could start about building this great identity management tool, but meanwhile, the industry's gone to passwordless identity management. And soon it will be, you don't even know who the person is, the nameless identity management. You're not managing them by their name. So it becomes harder and harder. But I think if you think about the way you're going to be marketing this and why this plays, it ultimately has to resonate with the end user community in a way that's going to influence a $1 billion market. So as you're thinking about who your competitors are and how this is going and how the story is going to be told, also think about the data you need to collect to prove your point. If there is no data and there's not a market and there's nothing different that customers are going to do, likely not going to have a great story. That's also going to likely influence how much funding you're going to get and how many people want to invest in you. So it all ties together.
Yes, definitely agree. During the times that we're in now, during this pandemic, do you have any recommendations? Do you see anything's changed regarding communications, reaching out to press?
Yeah, I think right now the press move on very quickly. What still companies are implementing, they're already thinking is adopted technology and they're ready for the next big thing. So we have to understand that right now, even though we haven't even been released here in the Bay Area to go back to work, people are talking about how to build your business back and what people are doing to build their businesses back. They're tired of the work from home stories. And so you have to stay current. I know one of our clients had asked about getting a story in CNBC for $1 million donation they were making towards the COVID release. And CNBC is a very high bar, and $1 million is really exceptional for a startup, but not exceptional as a story because most companies are doing at least that. So I think you have to think about everything you're doing in the context of what everyone else is doing, and whether that's really going to be news in the context of the entire industry, not just of you as a startup.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. Well, Susan, I thank you for your time, and this is fantastic information for our founder community.
Thank you. Nice to be here.